All right, welcome back. Let's try once more. Minister of Justice and Constitutional Development Mmamoloko Kubayi has announced that the government will make a list of convicted sexual offenders and gender-based violence perpetrators public by the end of February. That's this month. The minister says the decision to make the register public is a significant step by the South African government in its fight against GBV as well as femicide. Minister Kubayi also made the announcement at the Kgalema Motlanthe Foundation's 365 Days Against Gender-Based Violence Awareness campaign in Soweto. And for this discussion, let's extend a very warm welcome to Professor Lisa Vetten there. She's a research specialist in gendered violence at the University of Johannesburg. Professor, good to have you with us. Welcome. So quite a significant move on South Africa's part, following on the steps of other states like the US, where sexual offenders are actually registered and have a system in which they have to report their moves. But is it a sustainable solution to address as well as eradicate GBV and femicide in the country?
No, not at all. Unfortunately not. I mean, I think it's very important that we think about innovative and new approaches to trying to address the awful scourge of sexual violence in South Africa. But I'm afraid, and if you gave the example of the US, if we look at them, that's had absolutely no rates of sexual violence. And that's according to research undertaken over a period of 2 decades. So the intention is good, but this is not the best measure at all in order to address the problem.
And speaking of not it being the best measure, Professor, I mean, the National Strategic Plan that was actually adopted back in 2020 to address GBVF has shown that such legislation is at best non-effective if, of course, implementing or enforcing authority don't adhere to them. Most cases in this regard are still largely undocumented or even reported. Understandably, this will be a serious factor in this initiative.
That's absolutely correct. So if we look at only the cases that get to court, only 9% of rapes that are reported are resulting in conviction. Yes. So in other words, more than 90% of those alleged to have committed rape are not convicted. And obviously not all of them will necessarily be convicted. So we have a very, very small conviction rate. You've also got to remember that many sexual offences might go through, say, for example, at university. They might go through a disciplinary tribunal. They might go through a workplace disciplinary hearing in cases of sexual harassment. In schools, they'll also go through disciplinary tribunals. Those are matters where somebody might be found guilty, but they will never, ever end up on the sex offenders register because that only deals with criminal convictions. So that's just our first problem. Our second problem, and this I'll say from research that I've done with the South African Medical Research Council, is that probably about a third of those arrested for sexual offences do have previous convictions. But only 5% of those convictions are for rape. In fact, we do better to keep an eye on those convicted of robberies, house break-ins, hijacking, and theft. They account for 1 in 8 perpetrators who are arrested, as opposed to only 1 in 20 of those who have rape convictions when they're arrested. So we're also focusing on a very, very tiny minority. We would do better to look elsewhere if we want to make this an effective deterrent.
Absolutely. But long term, Doctor, this move will also go a long way in at least ensuring there is some sort of atonement or accountability, even if the perpetrators who will then think long and hard before they even commit such offences, we hope.
I'm not convinced of that, especially if we look at the US data. I mean, they've made public sex offenders registers through things like Megan's Law since the mid-1990s. And the research that is being done since then has come to the conclusion that actually the benefits of this far outweigh what it has cost. I think the department would do much better to be addressing the concerns of public protective report, for example. By now, they ought to be releasing the results, the recommendations that she makes about how they need to be equipping the courts to deal so much better with complainants. We have yet to hear what they're doing in that regard. I think we've also got to ask other questions about what is it that the police are doing and the courts are doing in order to make sure that we have more cases placed on the roll. That, I think, in the long term would be a much better investment of our money than making a sex offenders register published. Because I'm not sure what that's actually going to do. Is the idea that people will then chase those who have been convicted out of their neighbourhoods, burn their houses down, excommunicate their families? I'm not sure. I mean, because as it is, we're already not allowed to employ those who are on the sex offenders register in cases where any kind of job that requires them to have contact with children, with older persons, or those who are with people with disabilities, or those who are in shelters for domestic violence victims. So I'm not sure how much further this register can really go to ensure that dangerous people do not come into contact with those who are vulnerable.
We have to take into account, Doctor, knowing our system and how offenders often find ways to circumvent these laws, and even some officials will be complicit in such behavior. How will this initiative will then be foolproof against such corruption? And also, Prof, if one feels that they were actually unfairly listed due to insufficient evidence, we've got quite a lot of positioning that we need to study pertaining to this initiative.
Well, of course. I mean, I think firstly, the number one problem that the minister hasn't explained is how she's going to get past the law. The law says you may not disclose except to people who are seeking information about those who are applying for jobs. So she's going to have to push through, and I really don't know how she's going to do that, a very, very rapid amendment to the Sexual Offences Act in order to make legal this announcement that anybody, I'm assuming, in the public can go and look at sex offenders who's on the sex offenders register. And we have no detail as to how that's going to be done. Will it be online? Will it be right to the Department of Justice, which is currently the state? I don't know. So it's an initiative that is thin on detail, but I think because people feel so angry towards sex offenders, will probably feel like a positive step in the right direction, even though at this point it's very, very thin on detail and we don't know what the substance is. The other problem we're also going to have to get past is the backlog. The number of cases that still need to be put onto the register, which is also, I think, another difficulty that we have to address. And the other really important thing we have to think about, how does this register link with the National Child Protection Register managed by the Department of Social Development, which is much broader because it catches people who are, for example, have been found guilty by disciplinary hearings inside school. And there's another whole thing that could also be looked at, which is that there was a recommendation made that higher education institutions should be keeping a register of those found guilty of various forms of sexual offences within university hearings. So I think it might be much better to think this through on a longer term basis and move more slowly and work from evidence that tells us what works and what doesn't.
Absolutely, because I think the end of February is too soon a date to have all this information as well as legislation that needs to be communicated. Professor, thank you so much for your valuable input this afternoon. Professor Lisa Vetten, the gender specialist on violence against women, weighing in on the move by the Justice Department to publish sexual and GBV offenders in public.